I'm going to apologize in advance for the chaotic nature of this talk. I resolved to write a book about literacy and programming and universal literacy and universal programming. And I had this idea, what it was going to be about, this thesis. And I started doing research to sort of flesh it out. And about 6 weeks ago, I uncovered some information that changed the way I thought about the whole problem. Sort of blowing out my old thesis, but I haven't yet had a chance to come up with a coherent new thesis, which I'm working on. So this talk is pretty much going to be what I thought I was thinking, and then what I learned that convinced me that I hadn't been thinking about it the right way, and then the reframing of the problem that results, and then I don't know what happens after that. So what I used to think, and I've talked about it previous OSCONs, was that programming was a literary activity. Right? You're working with texts, you're writing texts, people are reading texts, and also because I came of age as a programmer in a milieu, in an ethos in which this was sort of the prevailing attitude. One of the great works that I loved was Donald Knuth and his idea about literate programming, which he wrote about a while back, in which his thesis was that programs were really works of literature. That when you wrote a program, it should be readable as a journal article, as well as executable by a computer. Ooh, I hit the mic. So this was a literary activity in the tradition of rhetoric. So, and it was precisely sort of coming across this thing, even though I trained as a computer scientist, that sort of got me interested in the classical art of rhetoric, because obviously programming was sort of the 21st century manifestation of the classical art of rhetoric. I think one of the sort of the curious side notes about this is that he called the system that he did to write these literate systems the web system. The reason he called it the web system is because that was really the only three-letter acronym that really wasn't used for anything in computer science. And that was sort of 10 years before they decided to use it for something else. Kind of funny that overshadowed what he thought it would be used for. Anyway, but he wasn't the only one who had this idea. Sussman and Abelson, this was sort of the introductory text for computer science a lot of places. And right from the introduction, they say, first, we want to establish the idea that a computer language is not just a way of getting a computer to perform operations, but rather that it is a novel formal medium for expressing ideas about methodology. And thus, programs must be written for people to read and only incidentally for machines to execute. So this is the tradition. Programming as literature. And the very next year, Mr. Stallman, living in the same place as Messrs. Abelson and Sussman, comes up with this GNU Manifesto, which I believe is informed by precisely this ethos, that people ought to be able to read code. In fact, that's the reason you write code, is for other people to read the code. And incidentally, it maybe is executable on a machine. So I've been talking about this, and I was going to write a book about this, until I read a collection of essays by Deborah Brandt on literacy. So we're going to have to back up in history a little bit to sort of understand where the confusion comes from. So the thesis that she talks about is, why do we have universal literacy? And it's one of those things that's like, well, of course it's a good idea, right? Everybody should learn how to read, right? But the question is, why? Anybody have a hypothesis? So So in Russia, apparently, you have to fill out a lot of forms, which is why you need to know how to read. But this notion of universal literacy sort of predates the filling out of forms in the Soviet Union or Russia. Yes, sir.
Spread the word of the Lord.
Yes, Piers, thank you. So in this country, it was informed by sort of actually two main myths that fed off of each other. So the one was the Christian myth, specifically the Protestant myth, that in order to be a good person, you had to do the will of the Lord, and in order to know what the will of the Lord was, you had to read it. So therefore, we needed to teach everybody how to read, so they could be good people. Reading was for good, as Deborah Brandt put it, not a good. And then the other one was the Republican myth, which is to have a democratic society, you need an informed citizenry. And how does the citizenry get informed? Well, they need to be able to read. And that her position is that all of the protections that we associate with free speech and freedom of the press and so forth were driven not because we were protecting writing or expression, but because we were protecting reading. Right? So in order to have an informed citizenry, they need to be able to read so that they can be informed. So therefore, you have to let people write the things that they need to be able to read. So reading was for good, but writing was a good. When you wrote, you were creating a product. And this goes all the way back to Charlemagne. In 789, he publishes a capitulary, which is what they used to call an edict, called the Admonitio Generalis, in which he says, and I'm not going to quote it in the original Latin, but he says, and let them join and associate to themselves not only children of servile condition, but also sons of free men, and let schools be established in which boys may learn to read. So which is the first time we have this notion of, well, semi-universal literacy, boys learning to read, but the thought eventually turned into everybody learns how to read recently. So reading you had to do because it was the good thing to do. Writing, not so much. In fact, this shows up in interesting places. So in South Carolina in 1740, a law gets passed that makes it illegal to teach slaves how to write. They're not concerned with slaves learning how to read because you have that Protestant ethic and this sort of myth about the white man's burden, and so slaves can improve themselves by reading. But writing is dangerous. People know how to write. They can spread seditious ideas. So writing, you don't protect as much as reading. Georgia passes similar legislation a few years later. And it's not until, I think, like 1819, Virginia passes, they suddenly realize that, if you're teaching them how to read, but not teaching them how to write, it leaks over. So in 1819, they make it illegal to teach them how to read or write. But it took 50 years to sort of work up to, there's negative downsides to not being able to read. Pamela Long, in this great book about authorship in the Renaissance, makes a second point about writing, which feeds into my confusion, which is looking at the different kinds of knowledge that Aristotle categorized in the beginning and dawn of civilization, which is the sort of three kinds of learning. There's techne, there's praxis, and there's episteme. Right? So techne is where we get the word technical. That's where you do stuff, right? You build things, and that's sort of the lowest kind of knowledge that blue-collar people do, right? And then there's praxis, from which we get the word practice, which is what military leaders and political leaders do, which is sort of the moving people to action, right? Management, we would call it today, right? And the learning that you do for that is of a higher order. And then finally, the highest order, which is episteme, which is the seeking for the truth, right? What academics do, right? Learning stuff just for the purity of knowledge. And when you look at the history of writing, the writing over time, from the Renaissance on, the writing is episteme, it's open. But writing about craft, writing about techne, is closed and secretive. It's valuable intellectual property. Just mention the spread of literacy happens because if people read, you can get uniformity of culture. So in Scandinavia, in the Middle Ages, the regime introduces literacy and teaches people how to read so that if the king promulgates an edict and it goes out to all of the towns, there's somebody in every town who can read it so that every town winds up obeying the law in the same way because they all understand it in the same way because they all know how to read. So it was actually a conscious choice to teach people how to read so that they could be good. But the writing is done by the administration. So I put all of this thing together and I come up with this new hypothesis. There are 4 ages of literacy. In the beginning, there is no literacy. Nobody reads, nobody writes, because we haven't invented it yet. And this is up through Socrates, we'll say. I mean, there is writing, but it's not, it doesn't enter into cultural consciousness. Socrates, in fact, rails against writing. It's an evil thing. Reading and writing is bad, because what happens when you write down your ideas, and then people read those things and they try to understand your ideas, but they can't ask you questions because you're not there. They're talking to the page. And if they can't ask you questions, they will misunderstand what you meant, so it's just a bad idea. If to spread knowledge, you should talk to people face to face. Plato agrees with Socrates, but he wants his ideas to sort of spread further, so he writes them down, explaining why writing is a bad idea. Aristotle finally starts breaking these things down into, there's different kinds of writing and there's different kinds of reading, and so some make sense, some don't, and he sort of classifies things. And so from Aristotle through Gutenberg, let's say, what you have is not a lot of people reading and not a lot of people writing. But you got some people writing stuff and some people reading stuff. And over time, the amount of reading and writing sort of increases, but basically, it's not universal. And there's some people along the way, like Charlemagne, who say, there should be more people doing this. But it doesn't happen. And then we hit Gutenberg, and we get the idea of mass readership. And that changes the whole way culture works in a number of ways, which we'll get back to. Then the next age, so then from Gutenberg on, we have lots and lots of readers, but still few writers. Writing is still a profession. You're doing it for good. You have these sort of... But because you have lots of readers, you have to invent ideas like copyright, because now writing all of a sudden is more valuable because you have mass readerships and so forth. Recently, we get into the mass writership phenomenon, right? And so we say Gutenberg is responsible for this mass readership thing just because it's so long ago that we can't remember all of the people who were involved, so we give him the credit. More recently, who do we give the credit for? It could be the guy who invented email, and nobody's quite clear on who that is. There's a couple of contenders. It could be the guy who invented blogging, so we could give it to lots of people. I'm gonna say Steve Jobs, just because he's the dead one on the list. You gotta... Gutenberg's dead too, right? I'm not picking on anybody. And now we live in a world where there's many writers and many readers. And one of the things that Deborah Brandt then says is, once you have the shift from few readers to many readers, all of our ethical concepts around, what was right and what was wrong sort of had to shift culturally to accommodate that. And it took 100 years or 200 years to do that. And because we're going to have the same shift from few writers to many writers, or from not so many writers to way many more writers, we're going to have a similar shift in ethics and culture. And you start to see that happening. So people start bemoaning the fact that the way we read is changing. We're not reading the way we used to read. But one of the things that you don't see is few people talking about the fact that we're writing way more than we used to. I read someplace that the average teenager produces more output in text messages in a year than Charles Dickens. Now, you may argue about the quality of it, but the quantity certainly is increasing dramatically. So let's try to bring this back to what does all of this have to do with free software, which is an excellent question. And as soon as I figure it out, I'm going to blurt it out. So Havelock, in talking about ancient Greece, discovers this general pattern of restricted literacy that applies to many other cultures. Shortly after the introduction of writing, craft literacy develops. And at this stage, writing is a trade practiced by craftsmen, whom others hire to write, as they might hire a stonemason to build a house, or a shipwright to build a boat, or a programmer to write a program. It's a craft literacy. So, yes, we are, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. It's the same thing as writing. So, we see that happening today. NEA has studies bemoaning the decrease in readership in the same study in which they mention that, writing is up 30%. The last thing that I want to tie into this is end-user computing. So the end-user computing movement has sort of similar kinds of things. You have the professional, right? End-user computing means, people writing macros and stuff. It's a kind of writing. Now, the ancient guild of writers say, well, no, it's not. It's sort of scripting, macro writing. It's not really programming. But in fact, more and more people start programming. But a large part of the ethos in, what does end-user programming look like that we talk about is, well, the programmers, the professional programmers, do all of this hard work to build together these systems and so forth, in which the users can just drag and drop these little icons and wire them up together, and it'll do all kinds of stuff. And that's end-user programming. You don't have to be very educated to do that kind of a thing because the programmers have done all the heavy lifting for you. And lastly, when you look at people, and these studies are from the 80s, things like AutoCAD and whatnot, when people are doing end-user programming, they band together in communities and help each other out and figure out how to get the job done. So this notion of a community of cooperating users around building a program is kind of a craft thing that doesn't need access to the underlying source code. You can have the community anyway. So Alan Kay is the guy who made me realize that this all came together. Alan Kay's view was that the reason people that you should teach people how to program was not so that they could learn how to program, but that so they could learn other things by writing programs. He wanted to teach children how to do music or construction or chemistry because they could try to express their ideas through a system where they would write things and it would give them feedback and they could explore. So this notion of writing things in an exploratory way is a metaphor that I think I'll credit Alan Kay with, and that's where you see for the first time the notion that that writing is for good, not a good. Alan Kay shows us that the act of writing itself, a program, is the ethical part. So now I'm going to bring it back to free software and what this means for free software. Oh, for those of you who missed it, my talk yesterday was the open source talk, and today's talk is the free software talk. So I'm going to take a small digression because I have time, because I mentioned that I sort of got involved in rhetoric with this whole thing because of Sussman and Knuth. So this notion that free software means software that respects user freedom, I'm just going to take issue with this from a rhetorical perspective. Okay? So when we talk about freedom of the press, the rhetorical device is called metonymy. Which means when we're saying freedom of the press, we're actually not referring to the press, the machine that presses ink onto paper. Press is being used as a word referring to the set of people who produce the news, journalists, editors, and so forth. That's the press. And this sort of transference, when you use the word to mean something else, is a metonymy. And in particular here, I think it's a synecdoche. Just in case you want to look them up. So when you say free software that respects users' freedom, it doesn't work rhetorically. Because software can't have respect. Software is an artifact, it's like that press, right? Software doesn't have freedom like a press doesn't have freedom. People have freedom. People respect other people. So free software, in order for this to make sense, has to be some kind of metonymy, which I'm not getting, right? Does software in this context mean the people who write software, programmers? Does it mean the publishers? So there's two possibilities. One is this is a synecdoche that I'm not getting. And the second is it's an enthymeme that I'm not getting. So an enthymeme is when you make a rhetorical argument and you leave out a logical step because everybody's going to get it, so there's no point in belaboring the obvious. So if there's an enthymeme here, I'm also missing it. So I'm not saying that this is wrong. What I'm saying is I don't get it. And I'm not picking on free software in this regard. Let me just mention that open source is an interesting rhetorical device in itself because open source doesn't mean anything. It's an open source something, and the thing is left out usually. People just say, oh, open source. And the rhetorical device there is called a solipsis. And that drives me crazy, too. All right. So now we're going to put all of this together and try to make sense. What does this mean for free software? Because I talked about open source yesterday. So there's three kinds of knowledge: techne, praxis, episteme. And we've been constantly talking about software and free software in the context of techne. We're building an artifact, and we should be able to see the code in that artifact because that would be the moral thing to do in order to give users freedom. It's kind of the way the argument goes. But what about code that's written for episteme? That's the Alan Kay idea. I write it because I'm searching for the truth, and I want to write this code. What does it mean when you talk about writing software for episteme? And I will give you the personal example that brought this home. I decided to learn Haskell this year. I've been talking about it ever since Outrageous wrote Perl in Haskell. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. But I sort of never buckled down to do it because it's so hard. So I'm learning Haskell this year. And then every time I tried to do it in the past, I failed because I tried to write something useful. So this time I said, oh, let me just do something that's not useful because this is not really about building something useful. I'm not trying to do techne here. I'm trying to do episteme. I'm trying to make myself a better person because I'll be able to write Haskell. So I went to Project Euler. And Project Euler is a place where they have all of these mathematical problems, and then you need to solve them, and you can't solve them with paper and pencil. You kind of need to write a program to do it because they have really big numbers, sum, all of the even Fibonacci numbers less than 1 million, right? So the algorithm isn't that hard, but you still have to write a program to do it. So that was my episteme. And right there in the fact section on Project Euler, and I did this, unfortunately, a week before coming here, and then it's just completely destroyed my presentation, and so I had to rethink it, and I'm not done. Is the question, once I solve the problem, can I publish my results? Can I release my great code as open source free software? And the answer is, it's an epistemological answer, not a technical answer. It's, that great feeling that you got when you figured it out, how much better of a person you felt because I got it. That's awesome. Do not steal this pleasure from your fellow human beings. It would be unethical for you to publish your source code. And that was the first time it occurred to me. Free software, in some context, is unethical. That's one of those crack in the dike things. Especially for a person like me. Then you go, I wonder how many other contexts it could be unethical in. So we're saying, well, you need to have access to the source code to change it so that you can make it better. Well, it makes it easier to do that, but the freedom really is the freedom to write something better. That's Project Euler. And maybe it's a good idea to start from what's there. Maybe you should just start from scratch. Maybe it's a better idea to start from scratch. So I started going down that path. Right? Are you creating a good, or are you writing it for good? Right? And the world's going to change when this happens, when you have lots and lots of writers. Teachers will be people who don't assign things for students to read so they will learn. Teachers will be people who will help students write stuff, give them the tools to write stuff so that they can figure out stuff for themselves. Right? They'll be writing for good, not reading for good. It's like what happened to Latin, right? Latin was the language you wrote in if you were educated. And that was sort of the distinguishing bar. If you wrote in Latin, then it was good. And if you didn't write in Latin, it wasn't considered literacy. Right? And this was a way of restricting the writing to the elite. And then over time, that leaches away, and you get more and more writers, and you can write in any language that you want. Right? And that's an increase in freedom. Right? And the reason that I mention this is just because I promised somebody that I would say something good about PHP at this conference. And that took some work. But so this disappearance of Latin is kind of like the transition from C to PHP. C was the Latin of programming, and of course, if you're a professional programmer, you had to write everything in C, and that was the high ideal of programming. But when you let people write stuff, even in PHP, you know that sort of the power centers are dissolving, and it's democratizing programming. Anyway. So now I start researching the history of orality and literacy with an eye towards, do I see parallels to any of this kind of thing in history? And Walter Ong has this, goes into this great and turgid discussion about literary criticism through the ages. And particularly he starts talking about intertextuality, right? And this is what he says about it. Print ultimately gives rise to the modern issue of intertextuality, which refers to the following commonplace. A text cannot be created simply out of lived experience. A novelist writes a novel because he or she is familiar with the kind of textual organization. That's what we're doing now. We have this notion. It's like you can't just write software straight from your head. You have to start with somebody else's software and then make it better. That's intertextuality. There's a word for it. And where does this word come from? It comes from manuscript culture, before the inventing of printing, right? You take intertextuality for granted, right? Because you create texts out of other texts. You borrow, you adapt, you share. And you don't care who wrote the original. This notion of copywriting doesn't come into play until later. Everything is built by cobbling together pieces that were already there. But print culture invents the notion of a work as closed, as set off from other works, a unit in and of itself. Print culture gives birth to what they call the romantic notions of originality and creativity. I wrote this, you didn't. Which didn't used to exist before because of intertextuality. Sorry? So, plagiarism didn't exist in the Middle Ages. So this is where we are. We're making that, so we're living in that, oh, I have to borrow stuff from other people, and that's a goodness, right? And I don't want to worry too much about the copyright, or if there is copyright because we had this copyright because writing had copyright, so we have to make that go away somehow so that I can live in it, so that the programming world can more closely resemble the medieval world of scrolls and handwriting before the invention of the printing press. Right? Because that's what it looks like. Let's make a website. What do I need? I need Tomcat, I need struts, I need Hibernate, I need Spring, I need AppFuse. I'm picking on Java here, but, we can go crawl through CPAN if you want to do that. No offense, Larry. right? And then AppFuse has these dependencies, and you got to bring all that stuff in. So in fact, it's very complicated to build stuff, and everything that you want to build has this intertextual quality where you bring in all of these pieces from various places. That's because we have few writers compared to readers in programming, right? If a reader is a user, right, there's a small number of writers for the large number of users, but that's changing. To take something that exists and modify it to make it better makes it worse over the long term. It introduces entropy into the system, right? And it's not just the Mythical Man Month that makes this observation, right? But the Center for Empirically Based Software Engineering has a bunch of studies that show that the kind of work that you do when you're trying to cobble together other people's stuff to make new things, that's the worst kind of programming to do. It takes longer. It's buggier. What is it that's the biggest success factor? Personal experience and skill. If you're a great programmer, you write better code. Even better than the code, a not-so-great programmer writes by borrowing somebody else's code and modifying it. And how do you get awesome personal skill and experience? Through writing, not reading. The same observation is made in the explanation of the law of leaky abstractions. The notion that, well, you could use somebody else's code that does an abstraction over what you want, except really when it doesn't work, you have to figure out what it is anyway. So the learning time doesn't change at all, because you still have to learn all the stuff you had to learn before. And maybe it saves working time. But the better thing to do is to write your own. So we start seeing that happening, I think. Right? Used to be forking was a bad idea. Oh, you want to say everything has to sort of stay in one place because if you had your own copy, then you're on your own. But it's not so bad to be on your own anymore. There's more programmers. Everybody can have their own copy. You can start forking stuff. All right? Plus, you don't need all that stuff that's in there. You only want a piece of it anyway. Right? So you take the whole thing, throw out the bits that you don't want, then you just have the piece that you want. Better off going your own way with that stuff. And the more writers there are, the more people can be doing this thing effectively. Right? And in fact, to use somebody else's code, well, to use somebody else's writing used to be you had to cite them. Right? You could only limit the amount of citing that you did, but now you can just toss in a link. And that's why there's so much twittering going on. You don't have to quote somebody. You can just say, go read that thing over there. And we can do that with programs too, although we're not in the habit of doing it. It says, oh, I need that subroutine. I could just call it because it's over there. That's what the API movement does. We're moving in that direction. So I don't need that code. It just slows me down. If it's stuff that I want to use, I could just link to it. So I was running over this presentation with an open source free software guy who said, no, you're missing the point. I need to be able to read the code because look what happened with Skype. Right? People did malicious things to Skype in China. And how would you ever figure that out if you didn't have access to the code? He said, I have access to the refrigerator schematics that I have. It comes with the refrigerator. How do I know they didn't insert something malicious? I don't know how to read the schematics. I'd have to read the schematics, right? This is coming informed from a position that says, oh, if you could read it, you would be good, right? You should read your refrigerator schematics for good. You should read the source code for the stuff that you're writing for good. That's not how you decide whether you trust it or not, right? You trust it. How about this? You trust it because you wrote it yourself. Oh, well, it's really complicated to write that stuff. Well, in a world where there are few writers and lots of readers, then I'm probably using something that somebody else wrote. But as we move to a world where there's more writers, and then, it's more likely that I'm writing something that I wrote. And you see this happening in places like the App Store, right? Hundreds and thousands of people writing stuff all the time. You don't like this thing, you can use that thing. Write my own. How hard is it to write an app? And languages keep getting better. All of these things that used to be really hard to do are not so hard to do anymore. Right? You don't have to do register allocation. Most languages, you don't have to do memory management anymore, right? Threads aren't as scary as they used to be. You could get symbolic debuggers for some languages, right? There's collections built right into the language. So as it becomes easier and easier and easier to use the languages, it becomes easier and easier and easier to write more and more complicated stuff. And if everybody were writing stuff, the episteme that they're doing, they don't want to look at other people's code. That would be unethical. And they don't need to look at other people's code as much on the techne side. So in a world where you have mass writership, you don't have this whole culture of, well, in order to write something, I need access to all of these other sources so that I can quote them and cite them and respect their copyrights and give them attribution, because that will show how scholarly I am. I can just, write stuff. I can make up my own stuff and write that. I don't know. What do I say next? Piers. I'm sorry? Piers says, writers learn to write by reading. And I used to think that. So my wife, who used to teach nursery school, I was wrestling with that precise thing. I said, well, there's a prerequisite. Writers learn by reading. And she goes, no, we teach writing first. I said, I'm leaving for OSCON tomorrow. You could have told me this in time for me to do enough research till I think about it. But I'm glad you asked the question. So it's like, there's some level at which you learn to write by reading other stuff. This is true. But my faith in the fact that first you learn to read and then you learn to write was shaken by Gina's observation. So the second thing that you're saying is one of the ways that you improve your writing is by reading other stuff. And that is true, but that's a different kind of reading than I need to read that in order to modify it, which is where free software wants to go with this thing. So let's stipulate that, yes, people need to be able to read stuff, so what we need is a corpus, a set of things that people can go read and say, yes, I see how that makes things better. We don't have a corpus. What do we read? What would you read to improve your programming? Piers would read the Smalltalk image to improve his programming. but I'm sorry? Rosetta code. So the difference, if you ask this question in English class, there's a sort of a crisper answer. There's a canon, there's a set of things. So what I would argue is, yes, there needs to be stuff that you can read so that you can improve your reading and learn. But assuming that there's a terabyte of source code floating around the universe, only a couple of thousand bytes of that are going to be in the canon that says, that's the Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare of code. You should read that because that's really the way to do it. It would be Larry's code that I would read. Larry doesn't read his own code. He's fully in the new millennium. He only writes to become better. So there needs to be some code, and this gets back to, but you're not saying like, everything has to be free. I don't need to be able to read all the code that there is. It doesn't help. Right? What would be really helpful is editing that says, don't read that, it's crap. Don't read that, it's crap. Right? Read that. But this gets back to and I'm not sure that I believe it, and this is what I'm trying to think through, is because that was that second age, right? You become better through reading. Right? And in programming, it's unclear that type of literacy and that type of literacy education, that is the way to become better. What Alan Kay was going for was, the way you become better is you try stuff and you learn and you get better. And I have to say, trying to learn Haskell, that's proving to be the case. I read a lot of stuff about Haskell, and it made no sense at all until I started writing Haskell. And then when I wrote my Haskell, I would look at it and go, that doesn't look right. Let me see it. Let me fiddle with it. And in the writing of it, I became a better Haskell programmer. Not that I'm a good Haskell programmer yet, but I've moved from really terrible to kind of terrible. But I expect that if I keep writing, I'll get better. So, yeah, I look around at code snippets, but I don't know that that's really the thing that's going to make me a better Haskell programmer. Oh, Larry.
Maybe part of the reason that people are writing so much nowadays is because their experience of reading was English teachers only giving them dreary, depressing novels. Maybe the same thing applies to computers. You know, we pass around these snippets, but they're all dreary and depressing.
So let me see if I capture that. The reason people are doing less reading and more writing is because all the reading that they were asked to do was dreary and depressing and boring in school. So they wanted to write more stuff. And that the same thing applies today, that all the code that you can download is dreary and depressing. And so you want to write your own, which is better. So I see that happening in a lot of code that was written 20 years ago. Let's look at Emacs. What happens to Emacs, right? There's Emacs, it's awesome. You know, you use it for 25 years, 30 years, right? Then you switch to TextMate, which is kind of like Emacs, only with a Ruby interpreter instead. Yeah, you could start from Emacs and, like hack on it and make it better by, swapping out the Lisp for Ruby. But actually, if you think about it, the best way to go about that is use Emacs, figure out how it works, and say, oh, I could write one based on Ruby from scratch, and that would actually be faster. Right? And then the Sublime Text guys come along and say, no, we could do this better, And so if you wanted to write a Python embedded one, you would do that. So chaining yourself to saying, I have to start by reading something else in order to get better, which is kind of Piers' sensibility. It's like, the way I'm going to get to be a better programmer is I'm going to read somebody else's code. No, I'm sorry. Piers is suggesting that I'm making a false dichotomy, that you need to write, but you also need to be able to read. But what I'm suggesting is, what point that I'm trying to make is, what I was arguing is, in the case of episteme, and I know I'm out of time, so we're going to have to take this into the hall. In the case of episteme, it's clearly unethical for somebody to shove their code in your face because you want to figure it out on your own. And in the case of techne, then, we argue, in the case of techne, it's easier and faster to sort of build something. What I'm saying is, it's more nuanced than that. Sometimes, even with techne, if you started from scratch, you might be better off. And when there are more programmers who can write things better because they have better foundational tools and better programming languages and better environments, it becomes easier and easier. There are more and more problems that fall in the techne space that one could write that way. And that's all the time that I have on the stage. So, but I will glad to continue the discussion out in the hall and let whoever the next speaker come up. Thank you very much.